you have to draw a distinction, as many historians are now doing, between the rise of societies with slaves and the rise of slave societies. And I would argue that it was the latter that really changed the relationship not only between Africans and Europeans, blacks and whites, but in some ways gave birth to this doctrine of white supremacy. I make the argument that the turning point actually was in 1655, with the fact that at that particular moment, the English had ousted the Spanish from control of Jamaica. And at that same moment, the Dutch, who if you had spoken to someone in 1650 would have been the leading power in the world in 2017, the Dutch had just been ousted from what is now Brazil. They had kicked out the Portuguese, but the Portuguese came roaring back. And with the Dutch being ousted from Brazil, what happened was that a number of individuals who had mastered the art of making sugar out of blood, that is to say, making sugar out of the enslavement of Africans, many of whom were Jewish. You saw that London was then able to oust the Dutch from what is now Manhattan, and also most of what we would now call the Middle Atlantic states and what is now the United States of America. And then by 1672, you had the systematizing of the African slave trade and the formation of the Royal African Company under the thumb of the king. The Africans, of course, did not cooperate with their enslavement, and they were rebelling. They were oftentimes outnumbering the Europeans on these islands, and that then, of course, led these Europeans to then move to places like South Carolina. And then, just to continue the chronology, in 1683, you have the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, stopped at the gate of Vienna with their onward march and their conflict with Christians, particularly in Western Europe, coming to a kind of ending of a chapter. And with the Ottoman Turks stopped at the gates of Vienna, you saw that it was easier then for the folks in Western Europe to sail southward into Africa, because many a times before the decline of the Ottoman Empire, those sailing southward from Western Europe to try to enslave Africans would then enslave themselves in Morocco, in what is now Morocco, what is now Algeria, etc. But then that barrier was removed in 1683, which leads to a further leap in the African slave trade, with that barrier removed. And then finally, in 1688, the merchant class, which had been chafing under the rule of the monarch in London in any case, not least the ability of the monarch with control of the Royal African Company to garner these lush profits, then clipped the wings of the monarch, leading to what might be called a bourgeois revolution and the opening up of the slave trade to these merchants. And that's when the slave trade takes off like a rocket, post-1688. And that's when these doctrines of whiteness begin to take hold, and white supremacy in particular. And then you begin to see doctrines built on that principle of exploitation. And that's what I would see as the origin story of white supremacy, although I'm continuing to do further research. And as you know, the research project, oftentimes it leads to newer revelations that overturn older so-called revelations. So if you talk to me in 2 years, I might come up with a different thesis.